The city lights blurred past the window of the small office. Each glowing pinprick, a tiny world she had, in some small way, helped shape. At 23, Alara had a quietness about her that people often mistook for shyness. She was beautiful, in a way that didn't shout for attention. Her features were soft, her eyes a deep, thoughtful shade of brown that seemed to notice everything and reveal very little. Long, dark hair was often tied back in a simple, practical knot, keeping stray strands from falling across the blueprints and plant diagrams that littered her desk. Her work, designing gardens and quiet green spaces for bustling urban lives, suited her perfectly. It was a job of patience, of understanding the hidden potential in things, and of waiting patiently for a design to reveal itself. It was a job of seeing order in chaos. Her day ended like most others with a precise tidy-up. Her pens were aligned, her keyboard perfectly centered, and her chair pushed in to the exact same distance from her desk each evening. This wasn't a nervous tick. It was a rhythm, a ritual that anchored her in a world that often felt too loud, too unpredictable. Colleagues liked her, though few felt they truly knew her. She was kind, always willing to help, but she never lingered for after-work drinks or joined in on weekend plans. She was a ghost who drifted through the office, leaving behind a trail of beautifully arranged succulents and the faint, clean scent of green tea as she stepped out of the modern glass building. The cool evening air was a welcome change from the stale, recycled air of the office. She didn't head for the subway stop like most of her coworkers. Instead, she walked 6 blocks in the opposite direction, her long, purposeful strides eating up the pavement. Her destination was a part of the city that didn't grace any tourist postcards. It was a district of warehouses and auto body shops, a place where the city's grit was laid bare. And tucked between a 24-hour laundromat and a shuttered factory was a gym with a small knit, a flickering sign that simply read, "The Foundry." Inside. The Foundry was the complete opposite of Alira's pristine office. The air was thick with the scent of iron, old sweat, and chalk dust. It was a place of function over form, with cinder block walls, concrete floors, and equipment that looked like it had been shipped over from a Soviet-era training camp. It was loud, a constant symphony of clanging weights, grunting effort, and the rhythmic thumping of heavy bags. This was Alara's other world. Here, her quietness was not a sign of passivity, but of immense focus. She greeted the old man behind the counter with a simple nod, a silent exchange they had repeated hundreds of times. He was a gruff, retired boxer, with a face like a roadmap of old fights, but he always offered her a small, crinkled-eyed smile. She changed in the women's locker room, a small, functional space with a single bench and a few locks that had seen better decades. She traded her work attire for simple, dark gray leggings and a worn, black t-shirt that hugged a frame that was much more defined than her loose-fitting office clothes ever let on. There was a wiry strength to her, a dense layer of muscle on her arms and shoulders that spoke of thousands of hours of disciplined, repetitive work. She began her routine, moving with an economy of motion that was almost hypnotic to watch. There was nothing showy about it. Her pull-ups were smooth and controlled, her chin clearing the bar with an ease that made the grunting man next to her look like he was struggling. Her sled pushes across the concrete floor were a study in pure, unadulterated power, her legs driving against the heavy weight until her lungs burned. She was an island of absolute concentration in a sea of chaos, her face a mask of neutrality, her breathing the only sign of the immense effort she was expending. About halfway through her workout, the door to the gym swung open, letting in a gust of night air and a burst of boisterous energy. 3 men walked in, all dressed in crisp, white karate gis tied at the waist with black belts. They carried themselves with an air of practiced importance, their chests puffed out, their shoulders square. They were a walking advertisement for their own dojo. The one in the middle, who seemed to be the leader, was a broad-shouldered man with a sharp, aggressive haircut and a perpetually smug look on his face. His 2 followers flanked him like loyal soldiers. Mirroring his posture and his swagger, their presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the gym. The rhythmic clatter of weights seemed to pause for a beat as other patrons glanced over. The three men ignored everyone else, walking to an open mat area in the corner. Their practice was loud. Every punch was accompanied by a sharp kai that echoed off the cinder block walls. Every kick was high and flashy, snapped back with a theatrical flourish. They weren't just training. They were performing. They were demonstrating their power for an audience they desperately hoped was watching. Ilara felt their presence like a sudden change in pressure. She was on her last set of deadlifts, loading the bar with a weight that would make most of the men in the gym pause. She focused on her form, her back straight, her grip solid, tuning out the world. But the leader of the karate group, whose name she would later learn was Ryo, had noticed her. At first, he had dismissed her as just another girl doing cardio or light weights. But seeing her heft that much iron onto the bar caught his attention. He stopped his kata mid-movement, nudging his friend with his elbow. "Get a load of that," he said, his voice carrying across the gym. "Trying to be one of the guys, huh?" His friend chuckled. Shouldn't she be in a yoga class or something? Ilara heard them, of course. It was impossible not to. A familiar, weary irritation settled in her stomach, a feeling she had experienced before in various forms. It was the sound of small men trying to make themselves feel big by belittling others. She did not give them the satisfaction of a glance. Instead, she took a deep breath, planted her feet, and pulled. The bar, loaded with hundreds of pounds, rose slowly, smoothly, till she was standing perfectly straight, her body locked in place. She held it for a second, then lowered it with the same control. The soft thud of the plates on the floor, the only response she offered. This lack of a reaction only seemed to annoy Ryo more. His ego was a fragile thing, and it demanded a reaction. He and his friends finished their loud, showy warm-ups and began moving towards the weight section, deliberately choosing the station right next to her. They were invading her space, trying to provoke a response. As she moved to the heavy bag to finish her workout, Ryo stood nearby, ostentatiously wrapping his hands with bright red hand wraps. "Hey," he said, his voice dripping with a false charm. He was talking directly to her now. "You know, you're going to hurt yourself with all that heavy lifting. It's not very elegant." Lara finished taping her own, much simpler wraps. She looked at him for the first time. Her gaze was not angry or scared. It was flat, appraising, like she was studying a particularly uninspiring insect. She didn't say a word. She just turned and began to hit the heavy bag. Her punches were nothing like his. There was no shouting, no big, dramatic wind-up. They were short, sharp, and devastatingly powerful. The sound of her fists connecting with the bag was a steady, rhythmic thump-thump-thump that seemed to make the air vibrate. She wasn't just hitting the bag. She was moving it, driving it back with every strike. She flowed around it, her feet light, her movements a blur of controlled aggression. The contrast between her silent, brutal efficiency and his loud, performance-based style was stark. Ryo and his friends watched, their smugness slowly being replaced by a flicker of something else. It wasn't respect, but it was a dawning awareness that this was not the easy target they had assumed. They saw the way the muscles in her back and shoulders bunched with each punch, the raw power coiled in her small frame. For a moment, the gym was quiet except for the sound of her fists. Finally, her set was done. She stepped back, breathing a little heavier, a light sheen of sweat on her forehead. She took a quick drink from her water bottle, her eyes scanning the room before she began to pack her gym bag. As she shouldered her bag and walked toward the door, Ryo couldn't let it go. The slight was too great. He had to get the last word. "Leaving so soon?" He called out, his voice laced with mockery. "Don't want to stick around to see how the real fighters train?" Ilara stopped. Her hand was on the metal bar of the door. She didn't turn around. The old man behind the counter watched, his expression unreadable. The few other people in the gym pretended not to be listening, but their movements had slowed. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then, Ilara pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool night, letting the door swing shut behind her without a single word or a backward glance. She had given them nothing. Inside the gym, Ryo's face flushed with anger. He wasn't used to being ignored. He felt a burning need to reassert his dominance. He looked at his friends, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He grabbed a towel and wiped his face, a slow, deliberate motion. "Let's go," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I think the little lady needs a proper escort." Asterisk, he and his two friends grabbed their bags and strode out of the gym, their playful swagger replaced by a new, menacing purpose. The heavy door clanged shut behind them, leaving the old man at the counter alone with the weights and the quiet hum of the building. A deep frown etched onto his weathered face. The night air felt different outside the foundry's doors. It wasn't just the cool temperature. It was the quality of the darkness. The streetlights here were old and weak, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and grab at the uneven pavement. Alara's footsteps were the only sound at first, a steady, rhythmic clatter on the cracked concrete. She knew this walk. She had walked it 100 times. She knew which puddles lingered long after the rain and which patches of ground were crumbling. It was familiar, and in its familiarity, it was safe. But tonight, that feeling of safety began to fray at the edges. It started with a sound that was out of place. A second set of footsteps, heavier and less rhythmic than her own. They were trying to be quiet, trying to sync up with hers, but they failed. They were clumsy, intrusive sounds in the quiet night. Alara didn't break her stride. She didn't turn around. She didn't speed up. To do any of those things would be to show fear, and in the language of predators, fear was an invitation. Instead, she simply became more aware. Her hearing, already sharp, seemed to intensify. She could hear the faint scuff of a shoe on gravel, the soft whisper of a voice. The footsteps behind her multiplied. Now, there were 3 sets, all keeping a deliberate, matching pace. They were no longer trying to be quiet. They were closing the distance, making their presence known. The air grew thick with a palpable menace, a feeling that slithered up her spine and coiled in her stomach. This was no longer a case of someone walking in the same direction. This was a hunt. Alara reached her car, a sensible, unremarkable sedan that was chosen for its reliability and not its style. It sat under a single sputtering lamppost that did little more than illuminate the dust on its hood. Her hand went into her pocket for her keys, her fingers closing around the familiar, cool metal. Her thumb found the button to unlock the doors. She pressed it. The cheerful, electronic chirp and the brief flash of her car's lights cut through the tense silence. A tiny beacon of normalcy in a situation that had become anything but. The sound was also a signal. It was the starting gun for them. Before she could take the final 2 steps to her driver's side door, a figure stepped out of the deepest shadows, blocking her path. It was the leader from the gym Ryo. He wasn't in his crisp white GI anymore, but in a tight-fitting t-shirt that showed off his muscular arms and a pair of dark athletic pants. He held a cocky, self-satisfied smirk on his face, but his eyes were cold and hard. He was enjoying this, enjoying the power he thought he held. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice a low, mocking rumble. Before Alara could even formulate a response, the other 2 men emerged from the darkness, flanking her on either side. They had her boxed in, a human wall between her and the sanctuary of her car. The one on her left was taller and lankier, with a nervous energy that made him fidget. The one on her right was stockier, his face a blank mask that hinted at a mind that simply followed orders. They were a pack. Alara didn't say a word. She stood her ground, her keys still in her hand, her body language loose and relaxed. To an outside observer, she might have looked like she was calmly waiting for a bus. Her heart, however, was not racing. It was beating with a slow, steady power, like a drum counting down to a battle. She was assessing, processing. She noted the distance between each man, the way their weight was distributed, the way their eyes flickered around, looking for any witnesses. There were none. The street was deserted. "You know," Ryo continued, taking a step closer, invading her personal space, "it's not safe for a beautiful woman like you to be walking around all by yourself at night." He let the word beautiful hang in the air like a piece of bait, trying to flatter and intimidate her at the same time. "Lots of bad guys out here." He looked back at his friends, who snickered on cue. They were playing their parts perfectly. Rio was the charming, dangerous leader. They were his backup, his audience. "We could, teach you how to take care of yourself," he said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "Real self-defense.
Not that.
Stuff you were doing in there." He gestured vaguely back towards the gym. "That's just lifting heavy things. That's not fighting." He was so close now she could smell the faint, cheap scent of his cologne mixed with the smell of clean sweat. He was trying to loom over her, to use his height to its full advantage. He was expecting her to shrink, to cower, to beg. That was the script in his head, the scene he had played out in his mind a dozen times with women who were easier targets. But Alara didn't follow the script. She didn't flinch. She didn't back away. She didn't even blink. She just looked at him, her dark eyes holding a stillness that was more unnerving than any scream. Her silence was a wall he couldn't break. It was a refusal to play the game by his rules. "You're not very talkative, are you?" Rio said, his smirk faltering just a fraction. Her lack of fear was confusing him, and his frustration was starting to show. "Maybe you're just scared stupid. That's okay. I can work with that." His patience finally snapped. The performance was over. He grabbed her arm, his fingers wrapping around her bicep in a grip that was meant to be painful, a sign of ownership. He expected her to cry out, to struggle. The moment his hand made contact, everything about Alara changed. It wasn't a violent transformation. It was a subtle, terrifying shift. The placid, almost weary look in her eyes vanished. It was replaced by a chilling, absolute focus. All the softness in her face disappeared, replaced by sharp angles and a cold, predatory calm. It was like watching a mist suddenly dissipate to reveal a perfectly sharp shard of glass. This was the look of a creature that has been cornered and has just realized it is far more dangerous than its tormentors. In the instant his fingers tightened on her arm, the world seemed to slow down. Every detail became crystal clear. She could feel the precise pressure points of his grip, the texture of his skin, the slight tremor in his thumb. She could see the pulse beating in his thick neck. She could feel the slight shift in the air as the man to her left, the nervous one, decided to move. He reached out, his hand open, intending to grab her other arm, to secure her completely. It was a clumsy, predictable movement. He thought he was helping, but he was just creating an opening. Before his fingers could touch her skin, Alara moved. There was no wind-up, no telegraphing of the movement. It was just ... action. Her right elbow snapped backwards with explosive speed, driving hard and deep into the taller man's ribcage. It wasn't a random strike. It was aimed with surgical precision at the small, vulnerable spot just below his armpit. The air was forced from his lungs in a violent, silent rush, a hollow woof that was swallowed by the night. At the exact same moment, her right heel came down, stamping with all her body weight onto the instep of his foot. The man made a choked, gurgling sound, a strange mix of a gasp and a cry of pain. His eyes went wide with shock and agony. The pain in his ribs was sharp and blinding. The feeling of the small bones in his foot grinding together was a whole new universe of hurt. His legs buckled, and he collapsed to the hard, unforgiving asphalt in a heap. His body curling into a fetal position as he tried to suck air back into his paralyzed lungs. The sudden, brutal disablement of one of their own sent a shockwave through the remaining two men. For a full second, they were completely frozen, their brains struggling to process what they had just witnessed. It had happened too fast. It hadn't been a fight. It had been an erasure. One moment their friend was there, the next he was a writhing mess on the ground. Their confidence, so bold just seconds ago, was now a house of cards, and a single gust of wind had just blown it over. Rio. The leader was the first to recover, but his recovery was not one of strategy. It was one of pure, ego-driven rage. He had been made a fool of. His power had been challenged, and in front of his followers, no less. A deep flush red color crawled up his neck and flooded his face. He let go of Alara's arm, stumbling back a step. "You're going to regret that," he snarled, his voice thick with fury. All pretense of charm was gone. There was only a raw, primal need to inflict pain, to to reassert his dominance. He lunged forward. It was a classic, powerful move, the kind of thing they practiced thousands of times in their dojo. His hips rotated, his shoulder drove forward, his fist shot out from his side in a straight, powerful line aimed directly at the center of her face. It was a technically perfect punch, a testament to his years of training. It was a punch that, if it connected, would have done severe, possibly permanent damage. He was putting all of his weight, all of his anger, all of his pride into that single, decisive strike. He thought it was over. He thought he had her. He was wrong. The world seemed to contract to the size of a single speeding fist. Ryo's punch was a thing of grim, focused beauty, a product of countless hours of repetition in the sterile, safe environment of his dojo. In his mind, this was the moment of triumph. This was the move that would restore his order. It was a straight line of pure intent, aimed to shatter the calm of this insolent woman who refused to play her part. For the stocky accomplice standing off to the side, it was a foregone conclusion. He watched, expecting to see the brutal impact, the spray of blood, the crumpling fall. Elara did none of the things that Ryo's experience had taught him to expect. She did not flinch or try to backpedal away from the incoming blow. She did not throw her hands up to protect her face in a frantic last-ditch effort. To retreat against a committed attack like that was to give the attacker more power, to allow the punch to land with even greater force. Instead, she did the one thing his training had not prepared him for. She moved towards it. It was a minute, almost imperceptible movement at first. A slight shift of her weight, a subtle rotation of her hips. As his fist closed the final few inches of space, she was already in motion. Flowing into the danger like water moving around a stone, her body turned just enough to the side that his knuckles, instead of meeting the solid bone of her nose, sliced through the air just past her cheek. She could feel the displaced air, a hot, urgent puff against her skin. His momentum, his entire sense of balance and purpose, was now carrying him forward into an empty space. This was not the block of a karateka. It was not a hard forcing force meeting of arms. It was a redirection, a subtle, intelligent use of his own aggression against him. As his arm shot past her, her left hand came up. It wasn't a punch or a grab. It was a sharp, open-palmed slap, delivered with a crisp, snap-like sound to the inside of his extended elbow. The impact was not about pain. It was about disruption. It was a small, precise shock to his nervous system, a jolt that scrambled the signal from his brain to his arm. His limb instantly went numb and floppy, the powerful punch turning into a useless, dangling piece of meat. Ryo's mind, which had been so certain a second ago, was now a blank slate of confusion. His body, which had been a coiled spring of power, was suddenly uncoiled and off balance. He was stumbling past her, his forward momentum now a liability, not an asset. He had overcommitted, and she had used it against him. The fight in his mind had lasted less than a heartbeat, yet he had already lost it. The second man, the stocky one, saw the flicker of disaster. He saw his leader, the invincible black belt, suddenly off balance and vulnerable. He saw the first man still groaning on the ground. A flicker of fear, cold and sharp, cut through his compliance. He needed to act. He needed to help. He took a quick step forward, his hands coming up. It's not in a trained fighter's stance, but like a man about to grapple, to grab, to restrain. This was his first error. Elara was already moving. She did not disengage from Ryo. She simply used his stumbling form as a pivot point. As he lurched past her, she turned with him, staying glued to his side. This movement brought her face to face with the second man. Her expression was still that terrifying, focused calm. There was no fear, no panic, just a cold, clear-eyed assessment of the new threat. The second man was faster than his fallen friend, but he was just as unprepared. He reached for her, his bulky frame intending to use his weight to overwhelm her. As his hands came towards her shoulders, she dropped her level. In a single fluid motion, her body folded at the waist and knees, ducking under his grasping arms. It was like watching a bullfighter pass under a charging bull. She came up inside his guard, her shoulder pressing into his chest. So close he could smell the clean sweat on her skin. He was too close to punch now. His own arms were wide and useless, his weight committed to a lunge that had met only air. For a split second, they were almost embracing a grotesque parody of a dance. But Alara had no intention of dancing. From this intimate, tangled position, she unleashed a series of attacks that were not meant for a sport or a dojo ring. They were meant to break a human body. Her right elbow came up, not in a wide, powerful arc, but in a short, brutal, piston-like motion, driving directly into the soft spot just below his sternum. It was a target he didn't even know he had. The force of the blow knocked the wind out of him in a violent, gut-wrenching rush. It felt like being hit with a car. Before he could even process that first shock, her left hand, which had been low, came up in a lightning-fast palm-heel strike. It wasn't aimed at his face or his jaw. It was aimed squarely at his chin. The impact was deafeningly loud in the quiet parking lot. A sharp, wet crack echoed between the buildings. It was the sound of his teeth clacking together violently, the shock wave of the impact traveling through his jawbone and slamming directly into his brain. His eyes rolled back in his head. For a moment, he just stood there, his body rigid, a glitch in the program. Then his legs simply gave out. He didn't fold or fall. He just switched off, collapsing straight down onto the hard concrete with a heavy, final-sounding thud. He was out cold before he hit the ground, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, there was a pause. The only sound was the ragged, pained breathing of the first man on the ground and the distant hum of the city. Ryo, his arm still tingling and useless, had finally managed to stop his forward momentum. He turned, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. He saw one of his friends, a man he had trained with for years. A man he thought was tough, lying unconscious on the pavement. He saw his other friends still writhing in agony, and he saw the woman standing over them. She was not even breathing hard. There was no flush of exertion on her face. The only thing that had changed was the look in her eyes. The calm focus was still there, but now it was layered with something else. It was a deep, profound weariness, as if this was a messy, unpleasant chore she was being forced to perform. She looked at the man she had just knocked out, not with triumph, but with a flicker of something that looked almost like pity. It was the look of a gardener who had just pulled a particularly stubborn and ugly weed. This complete lack of emotion, this absolute absence of rage or fear, was more terrifying to Ryo than any scream or threat could ever be. He was not fighting a person. He was fighting a force of nature, an implacable machine that simply did what it was designed to do. His entire worldview, his belief system built on the structured rules and rituals of his martial art, was crumbling around him. The black belt around his waist, a symbol of his pride and his power, now felt like a child's costume. But he was still the leader. He was still driven by a burning need to not be humiliated. The pain in his arm was being ignored by the fury in his head. He saw Alara turn her gaze towards him, and a primal, animal panic began to set in. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that if he stayed, he would end up just like his friends. His training was useless. His strength was useless. His only option was to retreat. He took a stumbling step backward, then another. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her. She didn't move towards him. She just stood there watching him, her posture relaxed but ready. It was the stillness of a snake that has not yet decided whether to strike. The possibility of it was more terrifying than the strike itself. "Ow. What are you?" he stammered, the words catching in his throat. His voice was thin, stripped of all its earlier bravado. Alara finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, level, and devoid of any inflection. It was a statement of fact, not a question. "I was leaving," she said. "You could have just let me go." The simplicity of the statement, the sheer profound truth of it, hit Ryo harder than any punch. This had all been so unnecessary. All of it. The posturing, the threats, the violence. It was all because of his pride, his insecurity. He had been the architect of his own humiliation, and she was simply the tool he had used to build it. He turned and ran. It wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a panicked, clumsy flight. He tripped over his own feet, scrambled to get up, and kept running, not daring to look back. He didn't even stop to help his friend, who was still conscious, moaning on the ground. He just fled. The sight of the still unconscious second man burned into his memory. He ran until his lungs burned, and the gym was far behind him, his black belt feeling like a brand of shame around his waist. Alara stood alone in the quiet parking lot. The sputtering lampposts cast long, eerie shadows. The man on the ground was still groaning, trying to push himself up onto his elbow, his face a mask of pain. The other man lay completely still. For a long moment, she just watched them. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a familiar, hollow ache. This was not victory. This was just failure on their part. It was a failure of judgment, a failure of character. She walked over to the conscious man. He flinched away from her, his eyes wide with terror, expecting another blow. But she just stood over him for a second, her shadow falling across his face. "He'll be okay," she said, her voice still quiet, referring to his unconscious friend. "But you should get him to a hospital. And you should leave." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned, walked calmly to her car, unlocked the door, and got inside. She placed her bag in the passenger seat, put the key in the ignition, and started the engine. The familiar sound of the car coming to life filled the small space, a return to normalcy. She glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The man on the ground was struggling to his feet, leaning heavily on the car next to him, finally starting to move towards his fallen friend. He looked over at her car, and their eyes met for a brief moment. In his, she saw not just pain, but a deep, abiding fear. He would never forget this night. He would never forget the quiet woman who was not what she seemed. She put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the scene behind her. As she merged onto the main road, the bright city lights washed over her, and the car became her little moving island of silence. She drove through the streets, not heading home, but just driving. The night felt heavy, and the silence in the car was no longer peaceful. It was filled with the echoes of the violence, the sounds of their grunting, and the thud of bodies on pavement. It was the price of her peace, a price she was forced to pay again and again by men who mistook her silence for weakness. And as she drove, the weary, beautiful, and powerful woman felt a profound sense of sorrow, not for herself, but for a world that so often confused kindness with cowardice. Asterisk. The city lights bled into streaks of color across the windshield, a watercolor painting smudged by speed and distance. Alara drove without a destination, the familiar hum of the engine a low, steady mantra against the chaos that had just unfolded. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, but her knuckles were not white. Her posture was relaxed, but every nerve in her body felt like a live wire, humming with a residual vibrating energy. The aftermath was always like this. It was a quiet, internal storm that followed the loud, external violence. She replayed the events in her mind, not with pride, but with a cold, analytical detachment. She saw the clumsy lunge of the tall man, the clumsy grab of the stocky one, the predictable, ego-driven punch of the leader. Ryo. She saw her own responses, not as actions of a person, but as the execution of a program. It was data in, data out. Threat identified. Response deployed. This was how her father had taught her, not as a sport, not as a way to build confidence, but as a necessary, ugly tool for survival, like learning how to suture a wound or start a fire in the rain. Her father had been a quiet man, too, but his quiet was different. His was a stillness that held the memory of loud, terrible things. He had been a man who carried the weight of a world that didn't exist on the blueprints she designed for a living. He had seen and done things that had carved deep lines onto his soul. In his greatest fear, the one that kept him awake at night, was that his daughter would inherit that world without inheriting the tools to survive it. So he had trained her, not in a gym with a membership, but in their basement. On a worn-out mat that smelled of dust and determination. He never called it fighting. He called it unmaking. He taught her that a fight is what happens when you make a mistake, when you let someone get close, when you lose awareness. The goal was to unmake the threat before it could become a fight. It was a brutal, efficient system of close-quarters combat. a hybrid of stark, effective techniques from various military and self-defense disciplines. It had no fancy names or belt rankings. It had only one principle: end it. End it quickly, end it decisively, and walk away. Every move she had made in that parking lot was a direct echo of his lessons. The elbow to the ribs, the stomp to the foot, the slap to the elbow to disrupt the nervous system. It was all there, drilled into her muscle memory, until it was more natural than breathing. As she drove, the sterile recollection of the techniques began to be replaced by the human details. The look of shocked pain on the tall man's face, the blank, uncomprehending stare of the stocky man just before he collapsed, the mask of pure, unadulterated panic on Ryo's face as his reality collapsed. They were not abstract threats. They were people. Stupid, aggressive, dangerous people, but people nonetheless. And she had hurt them. She had broken them. This was the part her father couldn't fully prepare her for. He could teach her the body mechanics, but he couldn't teach her how to live with the ghost of every person she had been forced to unmake. She wasn't a hero. She hadn't gone looking for a fight. She had simply been on her way home from her job, trying to find a small pocket of peace in a loud world, and they had thrust this ugliness upon her. They had forced her to become this other person, this efficient and violent version of herself that she kept locked away. They had made her pick up the tool she hated more than anything, and now she had to carry the weight of having used it. The car's fuel light blinked on, a small, insistent orange dot in the sea of dashboard lights. It was a simple, mundane problem with a simple, mundane solution. It was an anchor. She pulled into a brightly lit 24-hour gas station, the fluorescent lights harsh and sterile after the shadows of the warehouse district. She killed the engine, and the sudden silence in the car was deafening. She sat for a moment, just breathing, trying to let the vibrations in her body settle. A family was at the pump next to her. A father was trying to show his young son how to properly place the nozzle, while the mother laughed at their clumsy attempts. The boy's giggle was a sound of pure, untroubled joy. Ilara watched them, a strange ache forming in her chest. They existed in a world where the biggest problem was how to pump gas. It was a world she had just been violently torn from, a world she wasn't sure she could ever fully return to in that moment. She felt like a soldier on leave, standing on a peaceful street corner, while still hearing the phantom sounds of battle. She got out of the car. It's the cool night air, a welcome shock. As she unscrewed her gas cap, she caught her reflection in the dark window of the convenience store. She saw her own face, pale and serious. She saw the dark circles under her eyes that were always there, but seemed more pronounced tonight. But she also saw something else. It was a flicker in her own gaze, a hardness that hadn't been there a few hours ago. It was the look that people see before they realize they've made a terrible mistake. She didn't like seeing it on herself. She quickly looked away, focusing on the numbers clicking up on the pump. Inside the store, she paid for the gas. The cashier, a young man with headphones around his neck, didn't even look up from his phone. She was just another customer, another transaction. She was anonymous again. She bought a bottle of water and a small, bland-looking sandwich, her body reminding her that she hadn't eaten. As she walked back to her car, the family was just finishing up, the sun waving at her as they pulled away. She offered a small, tight smile in return. Back in the car, she didn't start the engine right away. She just sat there, chewing on the dry sandwich, her mind racing. She thought about Ryo. She could still feel the displacement of air from his punch. She could still see the look in his eyes as he ran away. It wasn't just defeat. It was the destruction of his entire identity. He had built his sense of self around the idea of being a powerful black belt, a warrior. In less than a minute, she had dismantled that identity piece by piece, showing him that his power was an illusion, a fragile shell that shattered on contact with reality. What does a man do when his core belief in himself is proven to be a lie? Does he go back to his dojo? Can he ever wear that black belt again without feeling the sting of her palm on his chin? She thought about the other two. The tall one would likely have bruised ribs and a broken foot. He would limp for weeks. The stocky one would wake up with a raging headache and a jaw so sore he wouldn't be able to eat solid food for a while. their injuries would heal. But the memory? The memory of being so easily, so casually, so completely broken by a quiet woman in a parking lot, that would stay with them forever. They would be different men now. Perhaps less arrogant, perhaps more fearful, perhaps a little bit wiser. The thought brought her no comfort. There was no satisfaction in breaking people, even people who deserved it. It was just a sad, ugly necessity. It was cleaning up a mess she never wanted to be a part of. She finished her sandwich and took a long drink of water. The physical act of nourishment seemed to help. It grounded her in the simple biological needs of her body. She was alive. They were alive. It was over. This was the mantra she repeated to herself on nights like this. It's over. You're safe. Finally, she started the car and drove home. Her apartment was a small, tidy sanctuary on the 10th floor of a quiet building. The elevator ride up felt like an ascent back to civilization. She stepped inside her apartment, locked the door behind her, and leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door. The silence here was different from the silence in her car. This silence was chosen. It was cultivated. It was her peace, but tonight it felt fragile. She walked through her small living room, past the bookshelves filled with books on botany and architecture. She went into the bathroom and turned on the shower. She stood under the hot, streaming water, letting it wash over her as if it could wash away the memory of the night. She scrubbed her skin until it was red, trying to feel clean again. She could still feel the phantom sensation of their hands on her arm, the phantom shock of her own impacts. She got out of the shower and wrapped herself in a thick towel. In the steamy mirror, she looked at her own body. She saw the faint old scars on her knuckles and forearms, souvenirs from years of training. They were a roadmap of her father's lessons, a history she never asked for. She was a landscape architect by choice. She was a fighter by necessity. Sometimes she hated the fighter for taking up so much space in her life, for marring the peaceful existence the architect was trying to build. She dried off and put on a soft pair of cotton pajamas. She made herself a cup of herbal tea and sat on her small balcony looking out at the sprawling city lights. The city was still so loud, even from this high up. But from here the noise was just a distant hum. From here she could see the patterns, the flow, the order and the chaos. It was the same way her mind worked. In the middle of a violent confrontation, her brain didn't see panic. It saw patterns. It saw openings. It saw lines of attack and lines of retreat. It saw the geometry of survival. She took a sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her. The internal storm was beginning to subside. The vibrations in her nerves were finally starting to quiet. She had done what she had to do. She had protected herself. She had defended her peace. That was all. She hadn't sought it, but when it came to her door, she had been ready. She would always be ready. It was a burden she carried, a dark skill she hoped she would never have to use again. But she knew with a certainty that was as much a part of her as her own name, that the world was full of men like Ryo and his friends. And so she would continue her quiet life, designing beautiful gardens, drinking tea on her balcony, and carrying the deadly, unseen knowledge of how to unmake any threat that dared to disturb her peace. The night was over. Tomorrow, she would go back to work, and she would be quiet, but she would never be weak again. Asterisk. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to seep into the city when Alara finally fell asleep. Her sleep was not restful. It was a shallow, fitful escape filled with fragmented images and the lingering echo of adrenaline. She woke a few hours later, her body stiff, her mind heavy, the taste of the night before still on her tongue. For a moment, she just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the city coming to life. The distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the first garbage truck, the murmur of voices from the street below. It was the soundtrack of a normal day, but for her, it felt like the world was playing a song she no longer knew the words to. Getting up was an act of sheer will. She moved through her morning routine like an automaton. The shower, the coffee, the simple act of choosing an outfit for work. Her movements were precise, her posture straight, but inside she felt hollowed out. She caught her reflection in the mirror as she brushed her teeth, and saw the same woman who had stared back at her from the gas station window. There was a new stillness to her, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, even if it was only in the brief, violent flashes of a confrontation. The office was its usual hive of activity. The hum of computers, the clatter of keyboards, the low murmur of phone calls and quiet conversations. It was a world of deadlines and design briefs, of plant textures and client approvals. It was a world that made sense. But today, Alara felt like an alien in her own life. Her colleagues, with their casual greetings and coffee-fueled chatter, seemed to be speaking a language she had forgotten. She nodded and smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She felt a gulf between herself and the simple, untroubled world they inhabited. She tried to lose herself in her work. Focusing on a complex new design for a corporate rooftop garden, she traced the outlines of pathways with a steady hand, selected shades of green that would complement the modern architecture. This was her art, her way of bringing order and beauty to a chaotic world. But today the lines on the page felt thin, the colors faded. She kept seeing other lines, the sharp, brutal angles of a fight. The graceful curve of a willow branch was replaced by the arc of an elbow. The pleasing symmetry of a stone pathway was replaced by the stark geometry of a throat strike around midday. One of her coworkers, a friendly, chatty man named Greg from accounting, stopped by her desk with a question about a budget line item. He was talking about numbers and permits, but his voice was just background noise to the sound still playing in her head, the heavy thud of a body on concrete. He noticed she wasn't really listening. "You okay, Alara?" he asked, his friendly expression clouded with genuine concern. "You seem a million miles away today." She looked up at him, forcing herself to focus on his face, on his kind eyes. She saw no threat there, no hidden agenda. She just saw a man being kind. It was a stark, painful reminder of how things were supposed to be. "Didn't sleep well," she said, the words feeling both true and like a massive understatement. It was easier than the truth. Easier than saying, "I had to violently unmake 3 men last night, and I'm not sure how to be a person who does that and also designs gardens." He nodded sympathetically. "Ah, I hate that. Hope you get some rest tonight. Don't work too hard." He walked away, and she was left alone again with the ghost of the night. She spent the rest of the day in a state of high-functioning disassociation. She did her work. She answered her emails. She attended a meeting. She went through the motions, but her mind was a million miles away, in a dark parking lot, under a flickering lamp. She was waiting for something, for the other shoe to drop, for the police to show up at her door, for a news report about 3 men found injured, for Ryo to come back, seeking revenge. The waiting was its own kind of torture by the time she left the office. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She didn't go to the gym. She couldn't face it. She couldn't face the familiar, controlled violence of her workout so soon after the messy, unpredictable violence of the real world. Instead, she walked. She walked for hours, through busy streets and quiet parks, letting the sea of anonymous faces wash over her. She watched people laughing on restaurant patios, couples holding hands, children chasing pigeons. She was a ghost among them, observing a world of simple joys and simple problems from behind an invisible wall. It was fully dark when she finally returned to her apartment building. As she waited for the elevator, a young woman she didn't recognize, who lived on a different floor, stepped in beside her. The woman was nervously clutching her keys, her eyes darting around the lobby. "Weird night," the woman said, trying to make small talk. "There were some guys hanging around outside earlier. Scared me a bit, so I stayed out late." Lara's blood ran cold. Her entire body went rigid. She didn't say anything, just gave a small, non-committal nod. The elevator arrived and they stepped inside. The woman continued, "My friend said she saw them take off down the street. Looked like they had been in a fight or something. One of them was limping pretty bad." Lara stared at the polished metal of the elevator doors. She saw her own reflection, superimposed over the dimming lobby lights. A quiet woman, a powerful woman, a deadly fighter, a landscape architect. They were all her. They were all true. When the doors opened on her floor, she stepped out. "Have a good night," the woman said, her voice cheerful now that she was safely inside the building. "You too," Alara replied, her voice quiet. Inside her apartment, she locked the door just as she had the night before. But this time, something felt different. The silence was no longer fragile. It was solid. It was earned. She walked to her window and looked out at the sprawling city. It was the same view she always had, but tonight she saw it differently. She saw its beauty and its ugliness, its order and its chaos. She saw its threats and its sanctuaries. She had a choice. She could let the events of that night hollow her out, turn her into a person who was always afraid, always looking over her shoulder. Or she could accept it. She could accept that this was a part of the world she lived in, and she was a person who could survive it. Her peace hadn't been destroyed. It had been tested, and it had held. She had defended it. She thought of her father, not with the heavy sorrow of the night before, but with a quiet sense of gratitude. He had given her a terrible gift, a tool for a terrible world, and last night she had used it. The fight was over. The waiting was over. She had not been violated. She had been the protector. She had been the guardian of her own quiet. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. The internal storm had finally passed. The silence that remained was her own again, deep and true. She was still Alara, the landscape architect who loved quiet corners and the simple beauty of a well-placed stone. And she was also the woman who had stood her ground in the shadows. The two were not contradictions. They were two sides of the same coin. A coin that had been minted in fire and had just proven its worth. Tomorrow, she would go back to her life. She would be quiet. She would be kind. And she would be quietly and unshakably powerful.